ask them, they will tell you they want to do better, earn more, feel better, and achieve more. But wanting something and deciding to do what is required to have it are two entirely different conditions, and most people never stop long enough to notice the gap between the two. You see, interest is a fascinating thing because it feels like movement even when nothing is happening. A person can be interested in improving their life for years and never make any meaningful change because interest does not require action. It only requires agreement. It allows someone to say, "Yes, that sounds good," or "Yes, I would like that," without ever rearranging their schedule, their habits, or their priorities to match that desire. Interest is comfortable because it does not demand payment. Commitment, on the other hand, is where everything begins to change. Because commitment requires a decision that has consequences. When a person becomes committed, they are no longer negotiating with themselves about whether they will act. They have already decided, and now the only question is how they will follow through. Commitment does not ask, "Do I feel like it today?" It asks, "What must be done today?" and then expects an answer in the form of action. Now, here is where many people quietly fall behind without realizing it, because they mistake strong interest for commitment. They feel enthusiastic when they hear a good idea. They feel motivated when they read something inspiring, and they feel encouraged when they imagine a better future. But when conditions become difficult, when progress is slow, or when effort is required without immediate reward, that interest begins to fade. It was never designed to carry them through difficulty, because interest depends on favorable conditions to stay alive. Commitment is different because it does not depend on how things feel. A committed person may not feel excited every day, but they continue anyway. They may not feel confident at every step, but they continue anyway. They may not see immediate results, but they continue anyway. That is the defining trait of commitment. It continues when interest would have already disappeared. It is not emotional, it is structural, and it holds a person steady when everything around them becomes uncertain. If you want to understand why some people move ahead while others remain in the same place, you must look at the moment where a person stops hoping for improvement and starts deciding to create it. Hope is important, but it is not enough. Desire is useful, but it is not enough. There must come a point where a person draws a line and says, "This is no longer something I would like to happen. This is something I am going to make happen." And from that point forward, their behavior begins to change. You can always tell the difference between interest and commitment by looking at a person's daily life. Commitment shows up in how someone spends their time, how they handle discomfort, what they are willing to give up, and how consistent they are when no one is watching. It reveals itself in small decisions repeated over and over again, not in occasional bursts of effort. Interest talks about change, but commitment organizes life around it. Life has a way of making this distinction very clear over time. Someone who is interested will start and stop, begin and delay, promise and postpone, because their actions are tied to how they feel in the moment. Someone who is committed will continue, adjust, and persist, because their actions are tied to a decision they have already made. One drifts with conditions, while the other directs their course regardless of conditions. And here's what I've learned. Progress is not an accident. It is not something that happens randomly to a few fortunate people while everyone else waits their turn. Progress is the natural result of a certain kind of decision, followed by a certain kind of behavior, repeated long enough to produce results. It begins the moment a person stops treating improvement as an idea and starts treating it as a responsibility. You do not move ahead because you wish harder than someone else. You do not move ahead because you think about it more often than someone else. You move ahead because at some point you decided more firmly than someone else, and then you backed that decision with action that continued beyond the moment of enthusiasm. That is the dividing line, and it is not as wide as people think, but it is as decisive as anything you will ever encounter. So the question is not whether you are interested in a better life. Because almost everyone is. The real question is whether you have made a decision that shows up in your daily behavior, your schedule, your priorities, and your consistency. Because once that decision is made, and once it is honored day after day, progress is no longer a mystery. It becomes a predictable outcome of the way you choose to live. But here's what else will decide whether or not someone moves ahead: how they handle responsibility. This subject is not always comfortable, but it is one of the most powerful turning points in a person's life. Because everything begins to change the moment someone accepts that they are responsible for their direction, regardless of their circumstances. It is easy to explain why life is difficult. Anyone can point to conditions, to setbacks, to unfair situations, or to things that did not go according to plan. Those explanations may even be accurate, and in many cases they are. But there is a difference between understanding why something happened and using that understanding to build a better path forward. One explains the past, while the other begins to shape the future. Many people spend years becoming very skilled at explaining their situation. They can tell you what went wrong, who was involved, what was missing, and why it was difficult for them. But while they are becoming more detailed in their explanations, they are not becoming more effective in their actions. Explanation without responsibility does not produce change. It simply makes the current situation more understandable without making it any better. The people who move ahead make a different shift. They begin asking better questions, and those questions change everything. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" they begin asking, "What can I do about this?" Instead of asking, "Who is at fault?" they begin asking, "What can I improve?" Instead of asking, "Why is this so difficult?" they begin asking, "What must I learn to handle this better?" These questions may sound simple, but they redirect the mind toward action. Responsibility is not about assigning blame to yourself for everything that has ever happened. It is about recognizing that your response to what has happened is within your control. A person cannot always choose their starting point, but they can choose their next step. They cannot always control the circumstances they face, but they can control how they respond to those circumstances. And that response begins to shape what happens next. Now consider what happens when a person refuses responsibility. They may feel justified in the moment because placing blame elsewhere can protect their sense of self. It can make them feel less at fault, less accountable, and less pressured to change. But over time, that habit begins to weaken them because it removes their ability to act. If the cause of the problem is always outside of them, then the solution must also be outside of them, and that leaves them waiting. Waiting is one of the most costly positions a person can take, because while they are waiting for something to change, nothing within them is improving. Their skills are not increasing, their discipline is not strengthening, and their understanding is not expanding. They remain in the same position, not because they lack potential, but because they have not taken ownership of what they can influence. Those who move ahead understand that responsibility is not a burden, it is an advantage. It gives them something to work with. It allows them to take action even when conditions are not ideal. It provides a starting point, no matter how small. And from that starting point, progress can begin to build. Responsibility turns a person from a spectator into a participant, and that change alone can alter the course of a life. There's also something else that happens when a person accepts responsibility, and that is they begin to see opportunities where others only see obstacles. When the focus is on blame, every difficulty looks like a barrier. But when the focus is on responsibility, every difficulty becomes something to study, something to work through, and something to learn from. The same situation that stops one person becomes a training ground for another. It is important to understand that excuses, while they may provide temporary comfort, carry a long-term cost. An excuse allows a person to step away from effort in the moment, but it also steps them away from growth. Each time an excuse is accepted, the habit becomes stronger, and over time, it becomes the default response to challenge. That pattern does not just delay progress, it prevents it. The people who move ahead develop a different habit. When something does not go well, they do not spend their time protecting their position. They spend their time improving it. They look at what happened. They look at what they could have done differently, and they make adjustments. This process may not always be easy, but it is effective because it keeps them moving forward instead of standing still. And here is the key point. Growth begins when ownership begins. The moment a person says, "This is my responsibility," they gain the ability to act. They gain the ability to improve, to learn, and to change direction. Without that ownership, even the best ideas remain unused because there is no one taking charge of applying them. So if you are trying to understand why some people move ahead while others do not, look closely at how they respond when things are not ideal. Do they search for reasons, or do they search for solutions? Do they wait for change, or do they begin creating it? Because the answer to those questions will tell you whether they are standing still or beginning to move forward. But there is another factor that plays a decisive role in who moves ahead and who does not, and that is how a person uses their time. This is one of those things that everyone understands in theory, but very few people apply with discipline in practice. Time is one of the few resources given equally to everyone, yet the results people produce with it are remarkably different. And the reason lies not in how much time they have, but in how they choose to use it. Every person receives the same number of hours in a day, but those hours do not produce the same outcomes for everyone. Now, why is that? You give one person time, and it becomes a tool for building, improving, and progressing. Give it to another, it becomes something that passes without much thought, something that is spent rather than invested. The difference between those two approaches, repeated day after day, is what eventually creates a gap in results that can no longer be ignored. One of the most common mistakes people make is underestimating the value of small amounts of time. They believe that meaningful progress requires long stretches of perfect conditions. And when those conditions are not available, they postpone action. They wait for a better moment, a quieter schedule, or a time when everything feels more convenient. But while they are waiting, time continues to pass and nothing is being built. The people who move ahead think differently about this. They understand that progress is often constructed in small segments, not just in large blocks. They learn to use the spare moments, the overlooked hours, and the time that others might consider insignificant. They recognize that a few focused efforts, repeated consistently, can produce far more than occasional bursts of activity, followed by long periods of inactivity. Another important distinction is how people treat delay. Many assume that postponing action is harmless, especially if they intend to return to it later. But delay carries a cost that is not always immediately visible. When action is delayed, progress does not begin. And if progress does not begin, it cannot build. What could have started growing remains at zero, and that lost time cannot be recovered. Failure, while uncomfortable, at least produces experience. It teaches, it refines, and it provides information that can be used for improvement. But delay produces none of these things. It simply keeps a person in the same place, with the same level of understanding and the same set of results. In many cases, postponement is more damaging than a mistake because it prevents even the possibility of progress. Those who move ahead understand that waiting until they feel completely ready is often a mistake. Readiness is not something that always arrives before action. In many cases, it develops during action. A person becomes more capable by doing, not by waiting to feel capable. They begin before everything is perfect, and as they move forward, they adjust, learn, and improve along the way. There is also a level of respect that successful people develop for their days. They do not treat time casually because they understand that each day represents an opportunity that will not return. Once a day has passed, it cannot be retrieved, and whatever was not done remains undone. This awareness does not create pressure, it creates intention. It encourages a person to use their time in a way that aligns with what they are trying to build. Now, this does not mean that every moment must be filled with effort, or that rest has no place in a productive life. Rest is necessary, and it serves a purpose. But there is a difference between rest and neglect. Rest is planned and intentional, while neglect is unplanned and often unnoticed. One restores energy, while the other quietly wastes opportunity. Understanding that difference is essential for anyone who wants to make better use of their time. People who move ahead also tend to have a clear relationship with what matters and what does not. They become more selective about where their time goes. They begin to recognize that not all activities carry the same value, and that some choices, while easy, do not contribute to their progress. Over time, they shift their attention toward what produces results, and away from what simply fills time without building anything. And here is the key point. Progress is not built on what a person intends to do someday. It is built on what gets done repeatedly, day after day. Plans can be useful, but they are only valuable when they lead to action. Ideas can be powerful, but they only create change when they are applied. Time becomes productive not when it is planned, but when it is used. So if you want to understand why some people move ahead while others remain in the same place, look at how they treat their time. Do they wait for the right moment, or do they begin with the moment they have? Do they postpone action, or do they take small steps consistently? Because over time, those choices accumulate, and they shape the direction of a person's life in a way that is both predictable and unavoidable. But time alone does not explain everything, because what a person does with that time matters just as much. You know, what skills do they choose to build, and how seriously do they take the process of becoming more valuable? This is where personal development moves out of theory and into something practical, because progress in life is closely tied to the value a person can offer to others through their abilities. It is important to understand that effort by itself is not enough. Many people work hard, but they do not see the results they expect. And the reason is not a lack of effort. It is a lack of direction in how that effort is applied. Effort must be connected to improvement, and improvement must be connected to usefulness. Without that connection, a person may stay busy, but they will not necessarily move ahead. The world tends to respond to value, not simply to need or intention. A person may need a better income, more opportunities, or greater influence. But those outcomes are usually tied to what they can do, what they can solve, and what they can produce. When someone becomes more capable, more effective, and more reliable in delivering results, they naturally become more valuable, and that value begins to attract opportunity. Now, this does not mean that a person must know everything or become perfect in every area. What it does mean is that they must take responsibility for improving in ways that matter. They must begin asking themselves, what skills would make me more effective? And then take steps to develop those skills over time. This could involve learning to communicate more clearly, to think more critically, to organize better, to lead others, or to solve problems more efficiently. People who move ahead tend to be students of improvement. They observe what works. They study those who are effective, and they practice until they become better. They do not assume that their current level of ability is fixed. Instead, they treat it as something that can be developed through effort, attention, and repetition. This mindset alone opens doors that remain closed to those who believe their abilities are limited. On the other hand, those who stay behind often continue applying the same level of skill while expecting different results. They may try harder, they may put in more time, and they may increase their effort. But if their approach does not improve, their results will not improve either. This can lead to frustration, because it feels like they are doing more, yet not moving forward. There is a difference between working hard at something and getting better at something. Working hard maintains effort, but getting better increases effectiveness. When effectiveness increases, the same amount of effort produces greater results. This is why skill development is so important, because it multiplies the value of everything a person does. Another important point is that growth must eventually become practical. It is not enough to feel more confident, more motivated, or more inspired if those feelings do not translate into improved ability. True personal development shows up in performance. It shows up in how well a person can handle situations, how clearly they can communicate ideas, how effectively they can solve problems, and how consistently they can produce results. Those who move ahead understand that they are building something within themselves that others can depend on. They become known for certain strengths. They become reliable in certain areas. They develop a reputation for being able to deliver, and that reputation is built over time through consistent performance. It is not claimed, it is earned. There is also a connection between value and opportunity that is worth paying attention to. As a person becomes more capable, they begin to notice that different opportunities become available to them. Not because those opportunities suddenly appeared, but because they are now prepared to recognize and handle them. Preparation and opportunity often meet in ways that are not obvious at first, but they are closely related. It is also true that income, influence, and advancement often follow usefulness. When a person becomes more useful, they are able to contribute in ways that others cannot, and that contribution becomes valuable. This does not happen overnight, but it happens steadily for those who continue to improve. Each new skill adds another layer, another advantage, and another reason for others to seek their involvement. And here is the key idea. People move ahead not just because they work, but because they improve. They become more capable, more effective, and more valuable over time. They do not rely on effort alone. They combine effort with development, and that combination produces results that cannot be achieved by effort alone. So if you are trying to understand why some people advance while others remain in the same place, look at what they are becoming, not just what they are doing. Are they building skills that increase their value? Or are they repeating the same level of ability day after day? Because in the long run, it is not just activity that determines progress. It is growth and capability that makes the difference. Now, before we finish up here, let me leave you with this, because this is what pulls it all together. A person's life is not shaped in a single moment, nor is it determined by one major decision. It is shaped gradually, through a pattern of daily actions that either build something or allow things to remain as they are. Many people are waiting for a breakthrough, a turning point, or a significant opportunity to change their direction. But more often than not, change begins quietly, through small disciplines practiced consistently over time. It is easy to underestimate the power of simple habits because they do not appear impressive at first. They do not create immediate results, and they do not always feel significant in the moment. But when those small actions are repeated day after day, they begin to accumulate, and that accumulation becomes visible in the form of progress. What once seemed minor becomes meaningful simply because it was sustained. Those who move ahead understand that relying on motivation is not enough. Motivation can be useful, but it is not dependable. It comes and goes, and it is often influenced by circumstances, emotions, and external conditions. If a person only acts when they feel motivated, their progress will be inconsistent because their effort will rise and fall with their mood. That pattern makes it difficult to build anything lasting. Instead, they develop standards that guide their behavior regardless of how they feel. A standard is a decision made in advance about how something will be handled. It removes the need to negotiate with yourself each day because the choice has already been made. When a person sets a standard, they are no longer asking, "Should I do this today?" They are saying, This is what I do, and then they follow through. These standards begin to shape everything else. They influence how a person uses their time, how they respond to challenges, how they approach their work, and how consistent they are in their effort. Over time, those standards become part of their identity. They are no longer something that requires constant attention. They become automatic, and that consistency is what produces reliable results. Another important point is that most of the decisions that shape a person's future are not dramatic. They are quiet and ordinary. They happen in the choices a person makes when they could take an easier path but choose not to. They happen in the moments when effort is required, but no one is watching. They happen in the decision to continue when it would be more comfortable to stop. These moments do not feel significant at the time, but they are the ones that build direction. Those who do not move ahead often fall into a different pattern. They rely on how they feel, they wait for the right mood, and they make decisions based on what is convenient in the moment. This leads to inconsistency, and inconsistency prevents progress from building. Even if they take action occasionally, it is not sustained long enough to produce meaningful change. There is also a connection between standards and self-respect. When a person follows through on what they said they would do, they begin to trust themselves. That trust builds confidence, not because they feel confident, but because they have evidence of their own reliability. On the other hand, when a person repeatedly avoids what they know they should do, they begin to weaken that trust, and over time, it affects how they see themselves. It's important to understand that discipline is not about being perfect. It is about being consistent enough for progress to take place. There will be days when things do not go as planned, but what matters is the overall pattern. Those who move ahead do not allow a single missed step to become a permanent setback. They return to their standards and continue because they understand that progress is built over time, not in a single effort. And here's the final point. The future is usually shaped long before it becomes visible. By the time results appear, the habits that created them have already been in place for some time. What a person does today may not seem important, but it is contributing to what they will experience later. The connection between daily action and future outcome is not always immediate, but it is always present. So when you look at why some people move ahead while others do not, you will often find the answer in the standards they live by. One person chooses to act with consistency, to follow through, and to maintain discipline even when it is not convenient. Another person chooses based on feeling, comfort, and momentary preference. Over time, those choices lead in very different directions. Some people move ahead not because life is easier for them, not because they were fortunate, and not because they had some special advantage. They move ahead because they think differently. They decide more firmly. They use their time with intention. They become more valuable, and they hold themselves to higher standards each day. That is the challenge, but it is also the opportunity, because those choices are available to anyone willing to make them.